I'm here with Sifu Lung Yat Tung, who recently returned from his trip to China. So tell us, Sifu, how many times have you visited Hong Kong, and what were your intentions for this visit?
I visited Hong Kong a total of 3 times, twice in 2017 and once so far in April of 2019. The intentions for this visit were to try to explore more of the Qisao of the different classes at the VTAA, and specifically wanted to connect with Sam Lau and also visit Fat San and connect with Ip Ji Ju and try to explore more of her training establishment.
And who joined you on this adventure?
It was Moi Tung and Ryan from Richmond, Mark, who has the school in Washington, D.C., Dave Bierce, who's got the school in Portland, Maine, and myself, I guess. So that was like, how many of us? That's 5 of us, including the Grandmaster.
Tell us about your favorite moment of the trip.
The thing that we were able to do on this trip that had not happened on any of the previous trips was some sightseeing. I really enjoyed seeing the Hong Kong Bay in the rain. Between the lower part of the Kowloon Peninsula, you can look at the city of Hong Kong that's on the island. And so we saw that in the middle of an afternoon, like in the rain. It's a really epic scenery. And then we drove to the top of the Hong Kong island, this really high point where, later in the day it was clearer and sunnier, and we were able to actually view the whole city and get the full sense of that island city in the Kowloon Peninsula, because previously we had been there. It's such a packed city and the buildings are so high and everything's so close, it's really hard to get a sense of the layout. You can look at maps and things like that, but you never really see the full city. So like the tourism thing was pretty interesting. I really enjoyed Qisao. I had a range of Qisao experiences at the VTAA that were very, very powerful. I had the opportunity to play some very deep, sensitive, structural Qisao with people in both the Ip Chung and John Wong classes at the VTAA. And I think that was really, those experiences were probably the most valuable training experiences. It was really great. And then visiting the temples in Foshan. So I guess that's 3 different experiences that I'm talking about that are all my favorite. One is sightseeing in, Hong Kong itself. Another, Qisaoing at the VTAA. And then sightseeing in the temples in Foshan.
Now, I know you went back to meet with some old acquaintances and connections that you made on previous trips. So who all did you meet and visit with this time around?
Well, we're really following up on, connections that we had made in our previous trips of particular importance to us. This is really Moi Tung's judgment that it's very important for us to connect with the class of Ip Chung, since he's the sort of senior representing the family or something along those lines. He's the oldest son of Ip Man and still teaching at the VTAA. I think he's 95. And he's just a very, very well-composed, very healthy, very interesting representation of the Kung Fu. So it's kind of out of respect to the art itself that we go and, work with his class and sort of showing face to the old lineage of Kung Fu. Also, we really wanted to make a point of continuing our conversation with Sam Lau. He's the chairman of the Yip Man Athletic Association. And, a really intense and interesting Kung Fu guy, and he's got a lot of history with the Moyat family. He's technically an elder of the Moyat family. So, he currently represents, and I think quite well and accurately, as, someone who was a devoted student of Yip Man. But actually his first Sifu was Moyat, and so, he really connected with us in a very respectful and powerful way. We look forward to working with him a lot in the future.
Who else did you meet up with?
Ip Ji Ju in Fat Shan is, a really compelling character. She is a student of Lung Kai, and Lung Kai was a student of Yip Man, who began training in 1938 as a child. So he was a part of a class that Yip Man had in the late 30s in Fatshan, and then he just continued his own training. And I think, Ip Ji-ju started training with him in probably the 90s at some point, and at this point she operates as a very successful, very well-respected Sifu in the city of Fatshan. So she is very graciously takes us on tours around the city and shows us historical sites, the former locations of the Yip Man home and the Yip family temples and interesting historical establishments, and things like that in Fatshan. And she translates for us. Actually, she doesn't translate for us. She reads the, inscriptions and things like that. We have a young man that we take with us as a translator, and, he speaks with her and translates. That's pretty necessary in Fatshan. Nobody really speaks English.
And you had also mentioned to me that you met with Buick Yip on this trip, correct?
Yeah, Buick Yip is a really great and intense guy. He's got a lot of history with the family. He was originally a student of Chu Shangtin, who, was a direct student of Yip Man and really like one of the original students that really nailed down the Hong Kong school. So he had a really old, powerful kung fu, Chu Shangtin did. But Buick Yip trained with him as a child, and then at some point, somehow his family moved to New York, and he thought he would never go back to Hong Kong. And he ended up training with Li Moishan as his Sifu. And so he joined the Moyat family, and he sort of reinitiated his kung fu and pursued learning Wing Chun under Li Moishan in the 70s. And at some point, he returned to Hong Kong and continued a business relationship and stayed connected with the Moyat family and Li Moishan, but returned to his original Sifu of Chu Shangtin and reinitiated his training yet again and resumed his relationship with his old Sifu in Hong Kong. So he's got a really interesting perspective of the Kung Fu family in that he did a lot of very powerful training in both lineages, and he's able to speak pretty authoritatively about the distinctions between the practice of the Wing Chun system by, two very, very powerful masters, that being Chu Shangtin and Moyat. And so, he's done a lot of interesting business with the Kung Fu family. He develops the Zhang business and things along those lines. And he does calligraphy. So, touching base with Buick Yip was kind of an accident, on the first trip we were there, but now we keep visiting him and we continue that connection, and he's a really interesting guy. He's got a lot of great stories and he likes to share Kung Fu.
Now, you had mentioned the Yip family temple. Can you tell us more about your experience visiting that and why it was so significant?
The Yip family temple is a fascinating establishment because it is really impressive. It's kind of that perfect classical Chinese temple that you would see in like an old Shaw Brothers Kung Fu movie. These temples are all built on a very specific plan where it's on the side of a hill, and there's a lower gate, and there's a middle gate, and then there's the upper temple as you go up the hill. And, at the upper temple, there's a shrine to an ancestor of the Yip family. So the really surprising thing is that the ancestor of the Yip family lived in 600 BC. So the Yip family has a contiguous lineage that they trace back to this powerful ancestor. Now, the Yip family temple seems to have been there for at least 1,000 years. And it is just an amazingly cool looking, incredibly detailed series of buildings. And I guess they have family gatherings there and sort of family reunions and stuff along those lines. It's kind of a historical shrine. It's almost like if there was a family in America that had its very own sort of Lincoln Memorial or something like that. There's a giant statue of the ancestor at the top of the temple. But there's common areas where there's like old guys from the Yip family hanging out, having tea and talking, whatever. And so it really anchors a sense of the culture that supported Yip Man in his training. And I think that's really noteworthy because it does seem to be the case that Yip Man began his training when he was like 6 or 8 years old, and that his training was rigorous and intense and very disciplined from that early age. So you'd wonder, how is it that, an 8-year-old kid is going to start training and be totally focused and totally serious from day one? And his family paid the exorbitant fees for him to become a personal student of Chan Hua-shun when Chan Hua-shun was late in his years and a renowned sifu. Why did his family pay that much to educate a child in high-level kung fu? And the idea is that they have this extremely prestigious history, this ancient history. And, even as a child, Yip Man would have had a present sense of that history just from being in that temple. The other fascinating thing about the Ip family is that according to what they're saying at the temple, when we were there, the Ip family has direct lineage connections to 25 million people in China right now, which is huge, of course, because, just for perspective, the entire population of the state of Michigan is supposed to be like 9 million. That's a lot of people. It's like the entire population of like the New York metro area or something like that. Like that's how big the Yip family is in China right now. And so the Yip family temple is really like a cultural anchor point for a truly deep, ancient, interesting family. It's huge.
And hadn't you mentioned to me before, too, that no other Westerners had been to that temple yet?
We did hear that. We heard that we were actually the first Westerners that had ever been there. I can't really verify that. I don't know if that's literally true, but I know that the old guys at the Yip family temple that we saw when we were there were shocked at our appearance. They were very friendly. They smiled, they shook our hands. We could hear in the conversation they had about us that they talked about us being, students of Wing Chun and, American Wing Chun disciples. We heard those words in conversation. And they escorted us to a shrine they have in the back of the temple that it's in a separate room. It's to the right of the temple to their ancestor. And it's a room that's just about Yip Man. So Yip Man has his own little museum in that shrine, but it's all in Chinese. It's not intended for Western audiences. I think it's just like an in-family thing. And they also had another shrine in there to another recent ancestor who was a general under Mao Zedong, who was also in the Yip family, fighting the Japanese occupation. So they have two honored ancestors of the recent time, and then throughout the various chambers of the temple, they have a number of sort of museums with portraits and histories of their Yip family ancestors. So it's a lot of history. It's interesting to see. And it's interesting to see that Yip Man really does have that honored place there.
Do you have any specific thoughts, stories, or ideas from this trip that you'd like to share with us?
I think one of the things I'm most impressed with is just seeing how smoothly the incredibly densely populated Chinese society functions. Like in Fatshan, when you're actually in the People's Republic of China, it basically just looks like America. Like, they'll have these American style normal buildings, but the streets are a little bit wider and they have wide bike lanes. And the pace of traffic is a little slower. Traffic is very dense, but they've done some really amazing urban planning that just accounts for having lots of motorcycle and bicycle traffic. And so you get these incredibly densely packed cities, and it seems to work. It seems to work better than you can imagine it would. The urbanization is massive. The cities just go on and on and on out into the countryside. The countryside just continues. You get all these buildings that are 3 and 4 stories tall, and then, you have the rolling hills with farms and things like that. But these apartment buildings just continue. It just goes forever. So you're never really out of the city when you're in China. And you'd think it would be claustrophobic, but they use the space so well, and they're so relaxed in the way they relate to each other in traffic and in business and things like that. They all just seem pretty relaxed. It's a highly functional society with a number of people that we can't even imagine. I would never have imagined that cities could even be that big if I hadn't seen it myself. It's huge. And I think Americans lack an appreciation for that. The other thing is we took a high-speed train. We took a bullet train from Hong Kong to Fatsan. And that train took about 40 minutes. In previous trips, we had taken a bus, and the bus had taken almost 4 hours. An equivalent distance would be like going from Detroit to Chicago. If we had a bullet train, we could probably make that Detroit to Chicago trip in under an hour. And China right now has, as I understand it, 30,000 miles of bullet trains throughout the entire society. And here in the United States, I think we have 0, which we're kind of asleep on that one. It's a really smooth, really amazing way to travel, and it was cool to experience. I want to mention all that stuff because the society is really massive and it's really complex, but they also have this ancient history. The temple in the middle of Fatshan has been there for 1,000 years, and in the same buildings. These little gray stone bricks are what all the buildings are made of, and it looks exactly like something out of a kung fu movie. And it has numerous shrines and monuments and ancient artwork and ancient calligraphy and ancient statues and all these monuments to old literature and old gods and, heroes of their past. And it's a lot of history, and it's right there in the middle of this very modern city. It's a really fascinating, deep culture. It is very successfully engaging the modern world. And, when we do Kung Fu, we have this process that comes from that culture that we can experience. We can experience, some of the ideas of that culture. And, I can say that I didn't really appreciate how profound that is until I actually went there and saw it. It's pretty interesting. I was very impressed by how successfully a lot of these really powerful old Kung Fu guys are chi-sawing into their 70s. You got all these guys in their 60s and 70s that have incredibly present, powerful Kung Fu. I'm tempted to sometimes think I'm getting old in my 40s, but then I hang out with some of these guys and they're just amazing. So I've got a lot to look forward to. We all have a lot to look forward to if we're serious about Kung Fu. It really seems like you should be serious about your Kung Fu getting to be even more powerful as you get into your 60s and 70s, we always have to train hard when we're young, but if you do that, the payoff does seem to be amazing. We were taken on a tour by a very, very good sport, this really interesting guy named Alfred. Got some cool pictures with him. He took us to a dim sum place in Hong Kong, on the Hong Kong island. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a famous dim sum place. And it really was amazing. There are places where the food is really awesome in Hong Kong. And on the last night we were there, we went to the Temple Street night market. And there's always this fantasy that you're going to find amazing street food in one of these kind of greasy little vendor places. And we found one, and they were pretty intense they send their wait staff out into the street to hand menus to people and insist that you eat with them. It's really pushy. But we were hungry, so we went with it. And we ended up sitting at this little card table. And everything they served us was amazing. The best roast pork I've ever had in my life. I can't even believe how good it was. Right there on that little card table on the street. in the night market. So that was a fascinating experience. So the street food in Hong Kong really is all that. It's amazing.
So speaking of food, was that pork dish your favorite, or did you have any experiences that topped that one?
There's always an amazing novelty in going to some of the really high-end restaurants where you can eat something like mantis shrimp that they'll pull out of a tank right in front of you, and you can watch them take it to the back room and kill it and saute it for you. And it's incredibly fresh, and the flavors are amazing. So that's like an exotic experience that's really interesting. But really, honestly, that roast pork in the night market is the thing I find myself thinking about. It was really great.
Tell us about some of the other historic districts and monuments that you visited.
Well, visiting the VTAA is kind of a historic phenomena in itself. It's a tiny little one-room school on like the third floor of an apartment building. And it's got plaques and images on the walls that describe the founding of the VTAA. But also when you're in there, you realize that in America, we've been seeing photos and video clips of all of the iconic sifus of Wing Chun that were students of Yip Man that all come from that one little room. So while you're standing there and you're looking at that zhong, you realize that that's the zhong that all these guys played. You talk about Chu Shang Tin or Wang Shang Long, or, any of those other guys that are no longer with us. Like, a lot of the images and video clips and things like that we have of them are from that room. And then, Ip Ching or Ip Chung or some of these other elders that have these, we've been out of curiosity, if nothing else, like just looking at these videos, and they're all from right there. It's a huge history from that one tiny room. A lot of training happening in there. The room is honestly not very big at all, and they do have kwans in there, and I wonder, how do they even do it? But they do a lot of chisao in there. And there is a giant monument. There's a huge bust of Yip Man that's in there. And, we've got some cool pictures of that. And like, that's the thing that really stands out in my mind as like the sort of historical pilgrimage, is that we can still go and see the room where Yip Man was teaching and where every master since has come from. It's right there in the VTAA. And then the ancestral temple in Fat Shan is the size of a city block. And it has within it, many other temples and, many other buildings. It has a Yip Man museum in it. And that Yip Man museum is filled with interesting artifacts and images from Yip Man's entire life. And that's very memorable. And it even has a lot of images and artifacts and descriptions from the various students of Yip Man who've gone throughout the world. That's all in that Yip Man museum in the ancestral temple in Fat Shan. But in that ancestral temple, there are also many other museums, some of which are really ancient, going back, 800 or 1,000 years. They've got weird old statues to like ancient gods and heroes from their old history. And it's huge and complex and visually fascinating. And hypnotically complex. They have many walls covered in individually sculpted tiny figurines describing every scene of a classical story. And you can stand there and stare at those things for hours, and you would never be able to process the complexity of what you're seeing. And there are many of those walls and statues of like ancient gods and spirits that we don't even know the stories, and there's many of them. I don't even know if we could know all the stories. A lot of the people are going in there and they are offering sacrifices and bowing and praying to these images and monuments and things like that. And we don't even know why. We don't even know this culture. So it's fascinating and mysterious, and that's a really powerful experience to see that happening. And it's a very cool place to play Kung Fu, and a lot of the martial artists from many styles from Fatshan will go in there. These old guys will be in there doing Tai Chi or Hung Gar or something like that. Any of the famous styles of Fatshan will probably see guys in there playing Kung Fu at some point. A lot of Wing Chun.
What are your reflections on training in China during this most recent visit compared to training in the US?
I think the thing that stands out most in my mind, comparing what you see in the classes, is that the classes are about the same size. It doesn't really seem like there are a lot more people training in China. But the age range is really huge. There are lots of teenagers in their training, and there are lots of these, like, obviously old retired guys in their training as well. And you get, really interesting training experiences. The different lineages in China, the different classes under the different sifus, do not seem to play hands with each other ever. And so the feel of their chi sao is very different. So you really get an incredibly distinct picture of the Wing Chun system in each class. They have different techniques that they favor. They actually will even target different ways of playing the techniques on the body and things like that. So it's a really diverse training experience. And then even within the same class, there will be people who have very different backgrounds, and they'll have a very different character in their chi sao. So in the course of one afternoon, you can chi sao with 6 or 7 different people in one class, and you'll have completely different personalities and completely different experiences with each one of them. So that's very interesting. And then the biggest idea in chi sao that really stands out is that some of them are very aggressive about how they play their techniques, with like sharp, even painful techniques played to the neck or the jaw or the face. Like, you can really get punched in the face in any of these classes. And there are certain people that always play their chi sao that way. So you really have to be prepared for that. You have to be relaxed about it. It's how they do it. And you have to respect that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, in all of the classes, there were people who almost never actually play techniques on each other at all. When their hands meet in chi sao, they do so very, very softly. And they're really using positioning and structure and very relaxed energy to find openings. And then once they find the opening to play the technique, they may not necessarily play it. They'll just show you that their hands are in on you and then stop and go back to rolling. And I found that to be almost more intense and more physically demanding than playing with the people who were like fast and sharp and playing to the face. Like, both ways of playing hands are very challenging. And I was finding that spectrum of people going from very soft energy, relaxed, deep structured chi sao, all the way into the aggressive face contact chi sao. That spectrum seems to exist in every class. Like, in every class, there'll be somebody there who's ready to punch you in the face, and somebody else there who's ready to play very, very softly. And I tried, as respectfully as possible, to play hands with everybody who was willing and really get the full experience, try and play through that entire spectrum. And in some of those classes, I did pretty successfully. In some of the classes, nobody wanted to work out with me, so I just didn't push it. I just ended up doing forms and kind of sitting there. Really a range of experiences.
What does the importance of strengthening our bond between the U.S. Wing Chun schools and the Wing Chun Athletic Association schools in China mean to you in the future of our training?
Well, one thing that I think is underappreciated is Mo Yat was an outstanding Wing Chun master. Like, his Kung Fu was surpassingly powerful and universally respected by anyone we've spoken to in Hong Kong. any of his students, any of his classmates. They have universal, very, very positive things to say about how his Kung Fu was constructed. And in order to really appreciate the differences in the details that he emphasized and the training methods that he focused on, to really understand why Mo Yat's Kung Fu was as powerful as it is, and why it's come through our lineage as powerfully as it has, you have to go see some other examples of how it could be done. When we were talking to Buick Yip, he was talking about the difference between the Chi Sao of Chu Shang Tin and the Chi Sao of Mo Yat. And, he said some very insightful things about how, Chu Shang Tin prioritized sort of filling out the whole range of motion defensively and receiving an attack and kind of absorbing and redirecting it. And that, of course, is a powerful Wing Chun principle that we call, Loi Lao Hui Sung. It means like escort what comes, follow what goes. And that's a really powerful Kung Fu idea that was emphasized in that lineage. And then there's this other, but he said that Mo Yat's Kung Fu was like an arrow, like always shooting forward, always penetrating. And then we could really see that emphasis, because of course there are classes that are really defined by that idea now in Hong Kong under Sam Lau. The way they do their luxao rolling, the way they play hands, the way they drive their body forward is very, it looks like the way we train. There are other really good, underappreciated or unknown masters in Hong Kong as well, who also have their strong luxao, deep horse, powerful Kung Fu ideas. But being able to just sort of survey the sometimes subtle and sometimes profound distinctions in how Wing Chun came through those early Yip Man students, it gives me a lot to appreciate in how we already train. So it's not like I'm going and trying to learn like new techniques necessarily. That'd be interesting. But even just to have a deeper grasp of the techniques that we already possess, and to have the experience of bringing the techniques that I already have into the conversation of the hands with these other lineages. It's an interesting challenge, and I think valuable.
What are your plans for future trips to China?
Well, I will probably continue to accompany Moi Tung on small group trips to China, and I will probably not try to bring a lot of my students along on those because they are expensive. And we do a lot of cultural exploration, and we meet a lot of old Kung Fu masters and have dinners and just hear stories. And that really does not involve a lot of intense training or playing hands. It is Kung Fu training, but it's Kung Fu training in a very different mode. I would not necessarily invite a student of mine to just go out to dinner with these old guys. It's a big tab, and then there's not a lot of working out that happens some days. Some days the working out is very rigorous, but it's crazy. Sometimes it's hard to figure out how to connect the talking hands, how to really have a dialogue in Chi Sao and have it not just break down. Like you want the Kung Fu to work. You want to be able to train with these people, and sometimes it's really hard. What we're working on is creating a training opportunity for people from the Moi Tung clan, the Moi Tung branch of the Moi Yat family, to be able to go and do a seminar in Hong Kong, which we will probably do with Sam Lau, using his school and his resources, and hopefully get him to actually share some Kung Fu with us in October of 2020. That's the goal. So I will probably take a few more trips over there to negotiate that and make sure that there's a good solid plan in place that will involve a lot of high quality training as well as some sightseeing and will not be ludicrously expensive. Hong Kong is the most expensive city in the world. We have to be careful about how we bring people over there.
We also have some questions from our social media followers. The first one comes from Kung Fu Film Fan. They ask, Sifu, what is your opinion on the state of traditional Kung Fu, as opposed to performance wushu, in the part of China that you visited? Do people seem to be as interested, less interested, or more interested in traditional Kung Fu training?
So on the Kowloon Peninsula, there's an ancient mosque. I don't know how long it's been there. It's old. And behind that mosque, there's a really fantastic park, and it has this big stone courtyard. And people always just call it Kung Fu Park. And every Sunday, various representatives from the traditional schools give demonstrations in that Kung Fu Park. So, the schools that are giving the demonstrations, and there's always a crowd of people that are there to see those demonstrations. So if you get on YouTube and you look at a lot of the traditional demonstrations that you'll see that happen, in the stone courtyard in a park, I didn't even realize I'd watched tons of YouTube videos of various forms demonstrations from the Kung Fu Park, behind the mosque in Kowloon. And, there are very, very strong performances from the Hungar schools, of course, Choi Li Fut schools, some other eclectic styles that, I'm not even sure exactly what I was seeing. And then the Wing Chun schools feature prominently. And those are all traditional fighting styles. You see, some of their forms are athletically rigorous and very impressive, but they're not just showing off their butterfly kicks. Like I really didn't see what I would call like the typical contemporary wushu at all in the Kung Fu Park. It was actually all traditional schools. It's a real phenomena. It's vibrant. It's happening. It can be experienced. Anybody can show up in the Kung Fu Park and just see these guys play their forms and do their demonstrations. It's pretty interesting. So obviously it's live enough to keep that public presence. But that being said, it doesn't seem huge. It doesn't seem bigger than what we've got going on in America. You'd imagine it would be epic, like all kinds of Chinese people. There'd just be huge crowds. And the people are there, but the crowds are not huge. It's cool because you can actually connect with these people. But it also seems like maybe it is a pretty marginal thing. Like maybe it's not a lot of people for China.
Laura Ann Grinder asks, as a Sifu, what did you learn from your visit to China that can be applied to your continued study of Wing Chun Kung Fu? What can you pass on to your students through your experience in China?
The first thing is just a realer and greater appreciation for its history. The real culture, the real lifestyles, because I'm connecting with people who are telling me the old stories. And I think that matters a lot. And then that range of ideas of Chisao, I think, at least the way I do it, I'm always tempted to get people to do Chisao the best way. Like I've got an idea of what is the best Chisao. And I'm always trying to get my students to do Chisao the most effective. But within those classes in Hong Kong, I think there's a greater range of sort of ideas about what Chisao is or what's acceptable. And I think, of course, I'm going to still be hardcore with people who are new to Chisao. But I think I'm going to be a little more open about how senior students play Chisao, just because I've seen how that can work out very interestingly in that Hong Kong environment.
Ocean Drive Slim asks, what roles did the long pole and butterfly knives play in China? Did you see forms being played a lot in the schools? And if so, what ability did practicing with these weapons produce?
The poles are there in the VTAA, and the poles are there in some of the other schools that we visited in Hong Kong. And, I didn't see people training with them a lot. I mean, they're there, people must be doing it. I just wasn't exposed to that a great deal. And that is one of the things that I really want to explore, the poles, in subsequent visits. I'm really interested in what those guys do with them or how. The knives, I actually did see one student playing with the knives in the VTAA in Yat Tung's class. And, I did see people playing with the knives in the school of Cheng Chi Peng, which is called Sung Mo, the Sung Mo School of Cheng Chi Peng, which is a little more south in the Kowloon Peninsula. And I would say that overall their approach to playing with the knives is more casual and more academic. Like they're kind of just teaching the forms. The difference, I would say, between what I saw there and the way we do it in the Moyat family in America is that, in my experience, we focus more on teaching the kung fu, meaning the actual ability associated with the weapons, teaching as much of that as possible before teaching the weapons, whereas it seems in Hong Kong they're quicker to teach the actual form. But I was playing hands with people who had learned those forms and trained them rigorously, and I don't feel like they got the kung fu of those forms. It's a kind of a weirdly abstract way for me to say that, but when you touch hands with people in our lineage who've done a lot of Quan training, it's a very different experience than with someone who has not. If someone's only just introduced a little bit of Quan training to just sort of get a workout, that's different than deeply studying the kung fu of the Quan. You touch hands with people who've done a lot of Quan training, you really, there are techniques that come out that are related to that, and there's power framing concepts in the body that comes from that, and I didn't see that exactly with the people that I was working with in Hong Kong. But, they do less horse moving generally in Hong Kong, and they don't have as heavy contact. Like, they're not punching each other in the chest the way we are in Hong Kong. And so I think they relate to the weapons training a little bit differently, because they use that to replicate some of those experiences, or they use that to study power. So, for instance, in Cheng Chi Peng's school, they have a range of Bat Cham Do of different weights. And there was a pair that he had that were 8 pounds each. So to hold one of those things is like holding a barbell. It'd be like holding an 8-pound barbell. And theoretically, those are his personal Bat Cham Do that he trains with or something like that. Whereas in America, for the most part, people don't even worry about learning the Bat Cham Do. Or the only people who do are really Sifus. And, it's largely a personal study, not seen in the schools, because it's kind of a abstract part of the system. Whereas something like Chi Sao or the Zhong is a much more present part of the fighting system, where, we really need those techniques, for self-defense. It's not like you're going to whip out your knives on somebody, or something like that. So our approach to that training is a little different. They're a little more casual about it, it seems, in Hong Kong. And it also seems like they are not so interested in tying those skills to their fighting ability. Whereas in America, we're interested in tying all the skills to our fighting ability. Because I think the reality is that we get in more fights. We're more concerned about them, even from early stages in our Kung Fu. There's really very little fighting of any kind that happens in Hong Kong, so far as I've seen. So there's a different attitude. The training of all levels of Wing Chun is more of a personal challenge rather than preparing for violence, because that kind of violence just doesn't seem present. But who knows? Maybe my perspective on that will change with future visits.
Kogi53 asks, which drills and which portions of the forms seem to have more or less focus comparatively?
I would say that in general, all of the classes in Hong Kong seem to bring a lot more of the zhong to their qisao. Almost all the senior students warm up doing rounds on the zhong before they play hands. And a lot of the techniques they use in playing hands are zhong techniques.
Barbara Jo Matson wants you to tell us the 2 most important things that you experienced while there.
I would say it's hard to really know which ones will be the most important. Only time will tell. But I feel that the most important experiences I had were doing qisao in the different classes at the VTAA and really observing this range of different ideas in qisao. There were qisao experiences I had where the contact was so light with some of these guys I was playing qisao with that you could hardly even feel anything. It was like their hands weren't even hardly there. And I was trying to work with that and join them in having this very, 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 very light contact qisao, and it was very interesting. That's working with one guy, and then the next guy I'm working with is just trying to chop into my neck and face as hard as he can. It was a dramatic contrast, and I feel like that was really interesting. There's a lot going on there. So that was the experience that I feel has really shaped my Kung Fu, and I feel like my own qisao has benefited from playing on both ends of that spectrum. So that I would say is the number 1 experience. The number 2 experience I would say that was most powerful was visiting the Ip family temple and being confronted with the depth and the intensity of that ancient culture that was supporting Yip Man in his training, even from his early childhood.
Panda Droid 92 asks, what type of exercise or drills do they do over there that you don't usually see in the US? Also, how is the food?
Probably the most relevant, I think, is the fact that these guys are warming up their zhong techniques. And they're usually focusing on just a few sections, 2 or 3 sections of the zhong that they're just playing intensively for a few minutes. And then they'll just turn around and go straight into qisao and try and really work those techniques from the zhong in their qisao. Normally you don't see people going over and hitting the zhong really hard, as their warm up to then go into qisao as often in America. Normally we have kind of a slow warm up to qisao where we'll play a bunch of forms and then play hands working with our stationary drills and then work through, playing hands without heavy contact and then escalate the resistance and get into heavy contact qisao. And sometimes people will even use that qisao as their warm-up to then go play the zhong. But the way these guys will do it is they'll play forms for like 20 or 30 minutes or something like that on their own. And that's just Silam Tao usually. Sometimes they'll play some Chum Kyu and Bilji, but a lot of people don't. And then they go straight to the zhong, play the zhong techniques that they're focusing on is what it seems like. They usually don't play the whole form. And then they just go straight to qisao, and then it's qisao for the rest of the class, pretty much, usually based in those techniques. If anything, they do less exercises. They do a lot less stationary drilling. It seems like they only really do Dan Qisao and Luk Sao. Really almost never saw anything resembling Pak Sao or Lap Sao done as a stationary drill. It just sort of comes out in qisao. So I would say our approach, I think, involves more exercises than what I saw in a typical class in Hong Kong. Food is generally amazing. It's very difficult to get good coffee. Pretty much have to give up on drinking coffee. Unless you can make it to a Starbucks there, because the basic roast that they serve in Starbucks in Hong Kong seems to be their 3-region blend, which is actually probably the best of the Starbucks blends. So it just seems like all the Starbucks coffee is just exceptionally good. So that's cool. All the other food is pretty interesting, with the really pleasant surprise being the street food in the night market. It was way better than I imagined it would be.
Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I think the most interesting thing is that we're going to continue doing this for several years. Like probably at least 4 or 5 years, I'm going to continue to try to get into these Chisao groups and try to, get into deeper and more interesting workouts with the people that we already know. Try and meet more people and see what other workout opportunities come from that. And, just keep collecting stories and, learning fascinating things about, the old Kung Fu history. But we're going to keep this up for a bit and create opportunities for students to come over there and do some high quality seminars at least a few times. And it's not out of the question that we might bring some of those guys back. We might be able to bring some of those people back to America, do some seminars here. That'd be an interesting thing.
Well, that sounds really exciting, Sifu. Thank you so much for your time.